Michael Brian, agus sílim bhil na cantarín méidir a cloiste go dtí seo ínta mai agus spricin se muid smuointe héin tás mú go trí Harama, so dhéana me sé dhearach fanart tistí an Gemmomache agus Beidir fanart faoin Gemmomache ag Bit Commission Dally. I do welcome today's debate and the other speakers that have contributed. I think it kind of entices all to think outside the box and go outside our own comfort zone and what we've been discussed when we look at these major issues. And I think it's appropriate that we're here in West Cork discussing this at the time that's in it, when the EU IMF are actually in town, checking out our homework over the last 3 months and making our finance minister write the lines on the blackboard if he hasn't delivered. And sadly, that's how bad things have got here in this state. I want to maybe just open up by saying, I've got some notes here, and I'm just going to say some stuff ad lib, because I think that we'll try and get into the questions and answers as soon as possible. But I think to start off, I think we need to recognise that there are always options. There are always options, and with those options, with those decisions that a government or a party or whoever takes, there's always a knock-on effect as a result of those decisions. But there are always options. And the question in relation to the debt problem, we have to ask ourselves, what would we want to do? So there are some of the options that we've heard today that requires us to have the consent of Europe to do them. So it requires us to go and argue for the Eurobond, it argues for the type of investment in terms of strategic investment, it requires us to reduce the interest rate, and all of those options are there, and we should be doing that maybe in a more vocal, more stronger way. But failing Europe responding, we as a country, we as a state have to ask ourselves, what options have we left? And I don't think it is abdicating the field to say that, that we need to default. The reason we need to not pay back some of the private banking debt is because if we pay that back in the here and now, the 12 million that was paid back yesterday or the day before, the 10 million that was paid back the week before that, the 14 million that was paid the week before that, and the entire 2 billion of unguaranteed debt that's going to be paid back in Anglo in the next 7 months. If we decide to do that while we wait for the masters in Europe to get their act together, then our options in terms of reducing the deficit, in terms of increasing taxes, in terms of providing for education, for health, in terms of providing for vulnerable communities and families are limited. And that's what we need to weigh up. It is absolutely sick that we have a state, and we discussed this week at length in Leinster House about the state of our health services. We as politicians in Sinn Féin raise issues in relation to students that will be forced to drop out of college because of changes to maintenance grants, because of burdens that are being placed on them and their parents because they can't afford a third level education anymore. We talk about the person with autism who's a danger to himself and a danger to others, who's got their special needs assistant withdrawn from them. And at the same time that we are paying out the money that we should be pumping into these areas and paying them out to bondholders, to bankers, and people who made investments, and if the investments came up right, then they would have got a good profit, but they're getting debt forgiveness today. They're getting our money, our special needs resources money, our health budget, our education budget is going to pay off those individuals, and it is reducing the options that we have. I think from a starting point we have to recognise that simply the process that we've been in for the last while, and particularly the last 6 months since the EU IMF programme was signed up to by this state, is simply not working. This week we've seen interest rate on 10-year government bonds surpass 13%. At the time we went into the bailout, if you want to call it that, it is a bailout because it's a bailout for the bankers. But at the time when we went into that arrangement, the interest rate was 7.6%. At the time we were told we couldn't borrow on the international markets because the rate was too high, and therefore we had to get our resources from the IMF. We were told that we would have to have a budget adjustment of 15 billion euro. And what people were telling us is, because look, we're spending too much than we're taking in. How many times have you heard that mantra? We need the IMF here, we need the EU, we're out of the markets, and we need to adjust. our spending because we are spending it more than we're taking in. And that's true. But there's two elements to this crisis. There's the exchequer deficit. The difference between what we're taking in and the debt and what we're spending. And then there's the other end of it in relation to our national debt. And it is simply, in my view, unsustainable that this country will be able to pay back its national debt in full. And when I say national debt, I include now what people are calling the national debt, the debts of the banks. €70 billion is about the figure that we're going to invest directly into the banks, about another €44 billion in relation to NAMA, and then on top of that there we have the interest rate in terms of services and that is increasing all the time. So it's simply unsustainable that you can have a point where you're reaching 125% of GDP and that people expect that that would be paid back in full. So there's a lot of talk about burden sharing or burning bondholders or defaulting. And the reality is, this state is already defaulting. When we started to impose losses on junior bondholders within our banks, it was a default. You can call it whatever you want, but basically the state offered through legislation that we will pay you 20 cents in the euro now, or when that bond matures in 2016, you will get 1 cent in the euro. It was a forced default. And people say that if you default, you have to adjust within 1 year. It's not. We're defaulting on junior bondholders. We will hopefully default on senior unguaranteed and Anglo, and it will not mean an adjustment within 1 year, which means that we'd have to cut spending by a third, which is what the right-wing presenters come out all the time to try and steer the left to say the idea of imposing losses on these bondholders will result in drastic reductions in living standards for ordinary workers and people in middle incomes. It is simply not true, because default is not just a simple mechanism. There is many ways that you can do it, through the likes of buybacks, through the scheme that is already there, through debt for equity swaps, and a number of areas in which way that you can impose loss sharing, but it can be done still in a voluntary way, but actually being imposed on people. So I think it's important to say that from the outset. The reality is that this programme, the EU IMF programme, is simply not working. And it's not working because it's based on the premise that we have to reduce spending, we have to increase the austerity, and at the same time that we have to bail out these private institutions, the bankers. And it is these two pillars of the EU IMF programme's response to the European crisis that is simply failing. We see some of the European peripheral countries such as Ireland, Spain, Portugal, Greece, all of them have ran up huge debts. Some of them, not all of them, are the same. The likes of Ireland and Spain, most of the debts that we've run up, or close to the majority of them, are banking debts. Others have different problems. And what we've seen is when the recession hit, the banks collapsed, the markets run scared, unemployment spiraled out of control, and now we're in the situation where we're at. So we have 446,000 people unemployed. Our debt to GDP ratio is expected to hit 112% by year end. And the gap between government borrowing and spending in the first 6 months of this year is 10 billion as of June. So the government, unable to turn to the international markets, has turned to the EU and IMF for support. And the support comes with strict conditions. In simple terms, the governments are told through a nod and a wink that they must bail out the banks, and they need to impose savage austerity on ordinary working people. So we're seeing cuts to wages, cuts to services are being made at the same time as billions of euros are being pumped into the bank. This is what we were told was going to fix the problem. This is what we were told was going to fix the banking system, what was going to reduce our deficit, what was going to restore market confidence, what was going to enable the government to return to the markets by 2013. If it were correct, then why is our banking system still not fixed? Why is it still broken? Why is our deficit and unemployment rates running higher than they were at the time? And why is our interest rate on Irish government bonds so high? And the answer is simple. The government misunderstands the cause of our economic crisis, and as a result of misunderstanding the cause of our economic crisis, they're applying the wrong solutions. Our problem isn't the exchequer deficit. That needs to be addressed, and that can be addressed. And there's a debate going on in relation to Sinn Féin argues that there has to be increased taxation. The effective tax rate here in this state is far too low for the higher earners. And it's not progressive enough just to have two simple tax bands. There's no reason a progressive system would have more than two tax bands, so that it would ensure that there's a fair distribution of taxes based on your income. There should be a wealth tax which would tackle those that have earnings or assets above €1 million. And there shouldn't be taxes on the lower income, such as the universal social charge that has been applied at €77, those with incomes of as little as €77 per week. So there are ways of reducing the gap in relation to the exchequer deficit, that €18 billion of a gap that's there. One is you increase taxes, the other is that you reduce spending. You could say that that is what the governments want to do at this point in time, but what they're doing is that the proportion is all wrong, and where they're increasing the taxes is directed in the wrong areas. So they're looking at property taxes, they're looking at water charges, they're looking at household charge, where we're looking at taxes at the higher end, those that have the savings in the bank that are not spending because they don't need to spend. So, on top of that there, what we need to do is stimulate the economy by using some of the wealth fund that we have at this point in time in the National Pension Reserve, and I'll go into that in later detail. But the core of the problem isn't our exchequer deficit. There are ways to deal with that there, and that isn't what forced us into the EU-IMF package. The core of our problem is the amount of debt that this state has combined. The fact that we're running up deficits every year, yes, but the fact that we had to put €44 billion into NAMA, or our debt liability in that area is about that region, and that in total we have about a debt liability of about €200 billion. That is why the markets ran scared. That is why we were being charged 7.6% interest rate last November. And the reason we're being charged 13%, while people would say that the whole reason is because of Greece, and Greece isn't implementing their package in the proper fashion, part of it, of course, has to do with the issue of Greece. But the reality is that the markets are looking at this state, and what we are continuing to do is take on extra debt, and were convinced in November that we had too much debt, and by taking on more debt, they are now more convinced that we will not be able to pay this back, so therefore they believe that we're going to default in the future and are unwilling to lend to us at reasonable rates. So that's where they're missing the point. And the point about our national debt is, and the irony of all of this here is that it doesn't belong, the majority of it doesn't belong to the state, it doesn't belong to our citizens, it is private banking debt, and some of it isn't even guaranteed. There is so much talk about the banking guarantee, one of the most disastrous decisions that the government have taken of any time. But if you look at the bonds that we're paying back over the next number of years, 7 billion this year, 13 billion next year, 17 billion the year after, 61 billion of bonds in total in the banks that we believe, that most of the public believe are guaranteed by us. They're not. Less than a third of them have the guarantee of this state. But this government, like the last, has moved beyond the guarantee. It is not only paying back guaranteed bonds, but unguaranteed bonds. And that's what we've seen happen this week with the unguaranteed bonds in Anglo-Irish Bank. So over 40 billion of the debts of the bonds that are being paid back are actually unguaranteed by the state. And there is no legal reason, there is no moral reason why that should happen. And the fact is that we're doing this, as we all know, to bail out those bankers, those people who took a punt and who lost out. So what we in Sinn Féin are arguing is it's time for a new approach. We simply can't pay back all of the government debts, and on top of that there, the toxic private debts of the banks. It just simply can't be done. And any attempt to do that, even if we're wrong, any attempt to do that would be wrong. Because by trying to do that, what you will have to do, no matter how progressive your measures are, you will have to take from the majority of working people to transfer money from them to these bondholders and bankers. And that is simply wrong. It is simply wrong whether we could do it or not. I believe it can't be done. So what can we do? Or what should we do? And some of it's at European level and some is at national level. First of all, we need to end the blanket guarantee. That banking guarantee was extended by the Fine Gael Labour government just a number of weeks ago up until the year end. And it's likely that they will extend the blanket guarantee when it runs out at the end of this year into the next year. So we should end the blanket banking guarantee. We should return the private toxic debt back to the private sector where it belongs. And that means forcing senior bondholders to share the burden of the crisis. And as I said, this isn't just having a go at them. There is no moral justification for paying back senior bondholders, particularly unguaranteed senior bondholders, paying back money that this country doesn't have in the first place. Whether one calls that default or debt restructuring really doesn't matter. The bottom line is that taxpayers shouldn't have to pay back for the bad decisions of private sector lenders and borrowers. Returning this debt to where it belongs is not only the ethically right thing to do, but it is economically right, as doing so will open the way for the government to return to the markets free from the excessive liabilities by the banking guarantee and by those private debts. Secondly, what we need to do is change the debate around the whole issue of the interest rate on the EU portion of the austerity programme. It is simply not acceptable, and I understand why it's happening, but it is not acceptable that our European partners are profiting from the economic difficulties that this state has. They're profiting in excess of €9 billion. So they're making a profit of €9 billion by extending us the loan. And the reality is, a lot of that money through the EU IMF programme is going back out to the banks and being paying bondholders in European banks, and indeed will end up with some of it in the European Central Bank. So it is simply not acceptable that they should profit to that tune. So what we're seeing at the minute is we're seeing Minister Noonan and this government are arguing now for a 0.6% reduction on borrowings of the future on the EU portion of the loan. If he was to get that tomorrow morning, it would equate to about 1.8 million of savings over the whole period of the loan. Yet, since this government has taken office, the cost of borrowing on the same loan has increased by about €1 billion. So the savings would be about 800 million. It is tiny in the comparisons of where we're at. So we need to change the debate, and he needs to throw away the begging bowl, and he needs to start on a major campaign about the fairness of the European structures profiting to such an extent against another member state. Thirdly, what we need to do is negotiate an EU-wide debt resolution programme which assists member states with the remaining levels of sovereign debt on the one hand, and assisting them to stimulate their own economies on the other. And Tom mentioned a lot about that there, so I'm not going to touch much on that there. The only thing I would say is that some of these proposals, and Yanis Varoufakis, who couldn't join us but has developed it in relation to the Eurobonds, are proposals that need Republicans to, we need to engage with those proposals, but there's major challenges for us as well. There's major challenges. Do you want to cede more sovereignty to the European Union? Do you want to cede more powers to the European Union and allowing them to raise these Eurobonds that we would then transfer 60% of our debt and they would refinance the debt? Do we want that? Because if it was simply to be offered in the way that Yanis Varoufakis in his document proposes, it wouldn't confer any additional powers on the European Union. But the reality is, to engage with such a process, the European Union will use any crisis to try and cede more sovereignty from member states to the centre. So there is a big debate in relation to maybe one solution that could help us get out of the difficulty that we're at, but at the same time, the long-term consequences of that there would be more loss of sovereignty to the European structures. And finally, what we need to do is use to stimulate our own economy. Jack talked about ways in terms of using private sector money to stimulate our own economy, but first and foremost, with €14.7 billion in our National Pension Reserve Fund. Everybody keeps on referring to it as 4.7. They've already accepted that the money is going to the banks. It should not go to the banks. That is our National Wealth Fund, and before we even try and convince private sectors to use their wealth to invest in our infrastructure, let's use our own National Wealth Fund to stimulate employment, to get the economy going again, and to provide a return for the Exchequer, because it has been shown in different models that when you stimulate the economy, that you see a return in excess of the amount that you stimulate. So what we need to do is reduce our debt. What we need to do is reduce our deficit, and what we do need to do is reduce our interest rate. Tom talked, and I'll finish on this here, Tom talked about how much it's costing us to serve our national debt. At the minute, we pay €5.2 billion on interest on our debt every year. In the next 4 years, that's going to increase to €9.2 billion. So about €30 million every day this state is going to pay out in servicing our national debt. Now, the only way we can reduce that figure, well, there's a number of ways of getting people back to work, stimulating the economy, but one of the immediate ways that we can reduce that is reducing the amount of national debt by actually imposing losses on bondholders. And to think that we're going to spend about 30 million every day in 4 years' time servicing our national debt, not even paying it back, just think of what that money can do. It would employ you about how many school teachers, how many nurses, how many SNAs would 30 million per day employ. It is a huge amount of money. We need to reduce our debt. And I think the conversation earlier on was very stimulating. But default isn't just a simple standalone scenario. If we default, it means that the other decisions that we take in terms of the exchequer side gives us more scope. We always have decisions, we always have options, but the reality is there is no sound economical or ethical or moral justification for transferring workers' money to bankers. It is simply wrong now. It will be wrong in the future.